What's up, everybody? Thanks for being here. I'm Will and this is The People's Health. We're going to do things a bit different in this episode. This week, we're going to tackle a huge topic, that's redlining. Needless to say, it's going to take several episodes to cover all the intricacies of what redlining is and how and what it still affects today. When we look at today's landscape of inequality, we must understand the historical drivers which created this landscape. That's why in this episode, we're only going to look at what redlining is by analyzing its history. We're going to look at maps, official documents, landmark cases, and legislation. So strap in as we take a trip into our past to better understand our present. Let's go. Redlining is a process in which banks and other lending institutions refuse to offer mortgages to customers in certain neighborhoods based on their race and ethnicity. If they did offer mortgages, they would do so at much worse rates than their white counterparts. Obviously, this was the clearest and ugliest example of institutionalized racism. It was how structural racism and inequality was designed into cities. And as you see from this in the following episodes, it hasn't completely been undone. But where did it all come from? In a span of 50 years, after the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, throughout the era of Jim Crow, local governments would enact and enforce laws that would segregate black families through housing. This was done through exclusionary zoning laws, which were city ordinances that prohibited the sale of property to black people. This was absolutely a thing until 1917, when the Supreme Court in the landmark case Buchanan v. Worley declared exclusionary zoning laws unconstitutional. The court, telling Louisville, Kentucky, that it recognizes police power and the promotion of public health and safety and welfare. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment assured to the colored race the enjoyment of all the civil rights enjoyed by white persons, effectively telling them that they weren't justified in denying rights to people guaranteed to them through the U.S. Constitution. But guess what? That didn't stop homeowners, as they quickly replaced the previous law with racially restrictive covenants. These were agreements between property owners that banded together to ban the sale of homes in a neighborhood to certain racial groups. It should be noted that not only black people were prohibited, Asians, Middle Easterners, and others were restricted as well. Some of these covenants even wrote in their bylaws that homes were limited to Aryans only. This, of course, was later found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as well in 1948 in the case Shelley versus Kramer. But by that time, the practice was so widespread it made it difficult to invalidate and reverse these individual agreements throughout the country, which is why we still see them in the codes today. So let's take a step back. Something else was happening in the country between 1917 and 1948. The end of the First World War, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Second World War all impacted the country in a major way. By the end of the Great Depression in 1933, the country saw itself facing a housing shortage. So the federal government began a program designed to increase America's housing stock. But guess who wasn't invited to the party? I don't even have to say it, because you already know. These housing programs, created under the New Deal, were meant to increase and segregate the housing stock in America. Richard Rothstein, in his book The Color of Law, said it amounted to a state-sponsored system of segregation. This presented a great opportunity for the federal government to take an equity-based policy approach to home ownership. Instead, the federal government did the exact opposite. It insisted that the properties it insured through mortgage had to include racially restricted covenants. The New Deal also created a program called the HOLC. It was meant to help homeowners refinance their mortgages. Together with the HOLC, the FHA introduced redlining policies in over 200 cities. The FHA Underwriting Handbook, beginning in 1934, included what is called residential security maps. This handbook was used to help the government decide which neighborhoods would make good and secure investments and which were off limits for mortgages. These maps were color-coded. Green indicated best, and they represented in-demand, up-and-coming neighborhoods where, get this, professional men lived. They were homogeneous by design and lacked a single foreigner or Negro. It gets worse. Blue indicated still desirable. According to the manual, these neighborhoods had reached their peak, but were still stable due to their low risk of infiltration by non-white groups. Infiltration. Now yellow, here's where the language starts getting really ugly. It indicated definitely declining. No doubt about it. Why? Because these are the areas that were considered risky due to the threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower-grade populations. Just saying that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And finally red, which indicated hazardous. These were neighborhoods that infiltration had already occurred. Too late for these. These neighborhoods were populated mostly by black residents and were described by the HOLC as having an undesirable population. Kind of gives you that caste system untouchables type of vibe. These areas were also, of course, ineligible for FHA backing. In The Color of Law, Rothstein describes how the FHA appraisal standards included a whites-only requirement. Racial segregation was now an official requirement of federally backed mortgages. These restrictions went on even further, as some mortgages would be deemed too risky if they were in racially mixed neighborhoods or even in white neighborhoods near black ones, for fear of possible integration in the future. Redlining came to an end with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which prohibited explicitly racial discrimination, putting an end to legally sanctioned redlining policies like those used by the FHA. However, things didn't necessarily get all better, as we'll see in the following episodes. That was part 1 of the history of redlining. I hope you all enjoyed it, learned something new, and share it with someone else. In the next episode, we're going to look at part 2 of the history of redlining, where we'll see how other forms of racially coded planning existed during redlining and continued after it ended. In the following episodes after that, we're going to take a look at how communities that are historically linked to redlining suffer from higher health disparities than others, and how this has been made worse by COVID-19. This will be part of a series on redlining by the people's health. If you want to learn more about redlining, residential segregation practices, and racially discriminatory policies that plague our history, I recommend you pick up a copy of Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. It's a great read. It's a great book to pick up during this time. If you have anything you want to share, including topics you might want to see explored on this channel, don't forget to leave a comment below. Also, more importantly, don't forget to subscribe, click the bell for notifications on new episodes, and of course, like this video. I'll see you again in 2 weeks. I'm Will, and this is The People's Health. Remember, take care of yourselves and each other. Peace.